Sarah. We are moving her. Now.
Arrest for obstruction of justice. My patient.
The first call of the day crackled through the speaker at 9:14 a.m., a familiar burst of static and urgency that cut through the low hum of the ambulance engine. Medic 15, respond to a wellness check, 4500 block of North Sycamore. Elderly male, no answer on the door or phone for 2 days. Police are on scene. Marcus Thorne acknowledged the call with a practiced calm, his deep voice a steady counterpoint to the city's morning rhythm. Medic 15 responding. His partner, Sarah Jenkins, a sharp-witted woman with a decade of experience and a knack for finding a pulse in the most chaotic of circumstances, expertly navigated the ambulance out of the station and into the flow of traffic. There was no wail of sirens for this one, no frantic race against the clock. This was the other side of their job, the quiet, somber duty of checking on the forgotten. They were a well-oiled machine, Marcus and Sarah. He, at 42, was the seasoned veteran, a former Army combat medic whose quiet confidence had a way of soothing the most frayed nerves. His large frame and steady hands were built for this work, for lifting, for stabilizing, for offering a solid presence in the middle of someone's worst day. He'd spent 12 years in the service before transitioning to civilian life, trading the dust of Kandahar for the humid asphalt of his hometown. He'd seen it all, or so he thought. He understood that chaos came in many forms, from the explosive violence of an IED to the silent tragedy of a life ending alone. His work was a calling, a way to bring order to that chaos, one patient at a time. The house on Sycamore was a small, neat bungalow with a perfectly manicured lawn that belied the potential tragedy within. A single police cruiser was parked at the curb. An officer, young and looking vaguely bored, met them at the door, which was already ajar. "We had to force it," the officer said with a shrug. "Neighbors were worried. Smells a bit." Marcus nodded, the scent of death already reaching him, a cloyingly sweet and unforgettable odor. He and Sarah pulled on their gloves, the familiar snap of latex a small, focusing ritual. They entered the dim, quiet house. The scene inside was exactly what they had expected. An elderly man lay on the floor of the living room beside an overturned armchair. He'd been gone for at least a day. Marcus performed the necessary checks, a formality that was still an act of respect. There was no pulse, no breath. The signs of lividity and rigor mortis were unmistakable. He was gone. While Sarah handled the initial paperwork and coordinated with the officer for the medical examiner, Marcus took a moment to look around the room. It was a life distilled into a single space. Framed photos on the mantelpiece showed the man in younger days, a soldier in uniform, a husband on his wedding day, a father holding a newborn. There were stacks of books, a half-finished crossword puzzle on a side table. It was a quiet end to a life that had clearly been full. "Name's Arthur Pendleton," the officer said, reading from his notepad. 86 years old. Looks like his kids live out of state. Marcus felt a familiar pang of sadness. It wasn't the death itself. Death was a constant companion in his line of work. It was the solitude of it. He believed everyone deserved the dignity of having someone with them at the end. His job, in these moments, was to be a professional witness, to ensure that this final chapter was handled with care and respect. They worked efficiently, documenting the scene, preparing their report. It was quiet, methodical work. An hour later, they were back in the ambulance, the scent of disinfectant failing to completely erase the memory of the house. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the unspoken understanding of a shared, somber experience passing between them. This was the rhythm of their day, a pendulum swinging between life and death emergencies and these quiet, poignant moments. They were the city's guardians, responding to its overt and its hidden traumas. As they headed back toward the city center, Marcus checked their supplies, restocking the jump bag from the main cabinets. He was meticulous, a habit drilled into him by the unforgiving nature of combat medicine. You never knew what the next call would bring, You could go from a stubbed toe to a multi-casualty incident in the span of a single radio transmission. Being prepared wasn't just a part of the job, it was the job. He was closing the cabinet door when the radio exploded to life again, the tone sharp, urgent, and utterly different from the call that had started their day. This was the one they were always prepared for. All units, multiple vehicle collision, I-95 southbound at the downtown connector. Reports of multiple injuries, entrapment, and a vehicle on fire. All available units respond. The calm of the morning was over. The storm had just arrived. The wail of the siren ripped through the air as Sarah stomped on the accelerator, the powerful engine of the ambulance roaring to life. The city, which had been a calm backdrop moments before, was now an obstacle course of cars and trucks to be navigated. Sarah was a master at it, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes constantly scanning, anticipating the moves of every other driver. Marcus was already in the back, pulling on a heavy-duty turnout coat over his uniform. His mind was a flurry of organized thought, running through protocols for a mass casualty incident. I-95 at the connector, that's right under the overpass, he shouted over the siren. Traffic's going to be a nightmare. We might be the first medical on scene. His role shifted instantly from paramedic to incident commander. He grabbed the triage kit, a bag filled with color-coded tags used to categorize patients by the severity of their injuries. Red for immediate life-threatening, yellow for serious but delayed, green for walking wounded, black for deceased. It was a grim calculus, but in a multi-victim scenario, it was the only way to do the most good for the most people. They could see the column of black smoke from half a mile away, a dirty black plume against the clear blue sky. As they crested the final on-ramp, the scene unfolded below them, a tableau of twisted metal and shattered glass. It was worse than dispatch had indicated. A semi-truck was jackknifed across 3 lanes of traffic, its trailer split open, its contents spilling across the highway. At least 5 cars were involved, crumpled and scattered like discarded toys. One, a dark blue sedan, was wedged violently against the concrete median, its front end almost completely sheared off. That was where the smoke was coming from. Sarah expertly maneuvered the ambulance onto the shoulder, driving past the growing bottleneck of stopped traffic, and pulled to a halt a safe distance from the burning vehicle, giving them a strategic position to work from. The response time was just under 6 minutes. Marcus was out the door before the vehicle had fully stopped, the 40-pound jump bag slung over his shoulder. The air was thick with the smell of burning oil, hot metal, and gasoline. He could hear the hiss of the fire, the distant sound of other approaching sirens, and the cries of the injured. "Sarah, grab the extinguishers and the Halligan tool," he yelled, his eyes already scanning, triaging. "I'm starting with the entrapment." He ran toward the blue sedan. The fire was still small, mostly contained to the engine block, but it was growing. Through the shattered driver's side window, he could see a woman, probably in her 50s, slumped over the steering wheel. Her face was covered in blood. He had to get to her now. A civilian, a man in a business suit, was trying to pull on the jammed driver's door. "It's stuck!" the man yelled, his face panicked. "She's not moving!" "Stand back, sir, I've got it," Marcus commanded, his voice cutting through the man's fear. Sarah arrived with a fire extinguisher, dousing the engine compartment in a cloud of white chemical foam, buying them precious seconds. Marcus took the Halligan, a heavy steel prying tool, and wedged the pointed end into the gap between the door and the frame. Using all his weight and strength, he leveraged it. The metal groaned in protest, then with a loud shriek, the lock gave way. He ripped the door open and immediately leaned inside, his world narrowing to the woman in the driver's seat. "Ma'am, can you hear me? My name is Marcus. I'm a paramedic." His fingers went straight to her carotid artery. He found a pulse, but it was fast and thready. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. Her pupils were sluggish. He saw the source of the bleeding immediately, a deep, gaping laceration on her left thigh, just below her hip. The jagged edge of the dashboard had nearly severed her leg. She was bleeding out. "Femoral artery," His mind screamed. He had minutes, maybe less. Ignoring the smoke and the chaos, he worked with a focused intensity that bordered on inhuman. He ripped open a package of combat gauze, a specialized material impregnated with a hemostatic agent, and shoved it deep into the wound, applying direct, brutal pressure. The woman groaned, a low, animal sound of pain. "I know it hurts, ma'am. You're going to be okay, just hang on," he said, his voice a low, calming mantra. "Sarah, I need a tourniquet now, and get me an IV line, 18 gauge, wide open." This was the dance, the desperate, intricate ballet of advanced life support performed on a stage of broken glass and burning steel. He was completely absorbed, his entire being focused on the single, critical task of keeping this woman's life from spilling out onto the floor of her ruined car. He was so focused, in fact, that he barely registered the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel beside him, or the sharp, authoritative voice that cut through his concentration like a shard of glass. "I need this entire area cleared out. Everybody back up, now!" The voice was sharp, laced with an impatience that felt jarringly out of place. It was a voice that expected instant compliance, a voice accustomed to being the loudest and most important in any room. Marcus didn't look up. He couldn't. The woman in the car, his patient, was on a razor's edge. Every second he spent distracted was a second she slipped further away. Sarah had just handed him the tourniquet, and he was working it high up on the woman's thigh, just above the wound. He cinched it tight, twisting the windlass until the flow of bright red arterial blood slowed to a dark, manageable ooze. "I'm a paramedic," Marcus said, his voice firm but his eyes still locked on his patient. "I have a critical patient here with a femoral bleed. I can't move her yet." "I don't care who you are. This is a potential crime scene and an active fire risk. I'm giving you a lawful order. Clear the vehicle." The voice was closer now, more insistent. This time, Marcus risked a glance over his shoulder. A police officer stood there, his shadow falling across the open car door. He was young, probably in his late 20s, with a tightly squared jaw and mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes, creating an impassive, intimidating mask. The nameplate on his uniform read Riley. His hand was resting on his holstered firearm, a posture of casual dominance. The entire set of his body screamed aggression. This wasn't an officer here to help. This was an officer here to take control. "Officer, with all due respect, my priority right now is keeping this woman alive," Marcus said, his tone deliberately even. He had to de-escalate this. His patient's life depended on it. "The fire is contained. My partner and I are stabilizing her for immediate transport. As soon as she's on the stretcher, the scene is yours." Officer Riley took another step closer, planting his boots firmly on the asphalt, a territorial stance. "Your priority is to follow my orders. I determine the scene is safe, not you. Now, I'm not going to tell you again, get out of the car." A cold, hard knot of disbelief and anger began to form in Marcus's gut. He'd worked alongside police officers for nearly 15 years. He understood the need to coordinate, to respect jurisdictions. He'd worked with rookies and veterans, good cops and mediocre ones. But he'd never encountered anything like this. A complete and utter disregard for the life hanging in the balance in favor of asserting authority. The woman in the car moaned again, her eyelids fluttering. Her blood pressure was bottoming out. "Sarah, IV line," Marcus commanded, turning his full attention back to the patient, effectively dismissing the officer looming over him. He had made a decision. He would not be intimidated. He would not let this officer's ego trip cost his patient her life. He could feel Officer Riley's glare on his back. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, one that had nothing to do with the wreck and everything to do with a clash of wills. "Did you not hear me?" Riley's voice was low and menacing now. "I gave you a lawful order, paramedic, and I am following my lawful duty as a licensed medical professional to provide life-saving care," Marcus retorted, his eyes still locked on his patient as he expertly slid an 18-gauge needle into a vein in her arm. "Interfering with that treatment is a crime. Now, you can either help us by securing a landing zone for a life flight helicopter, or you can step back and let us do our jobs." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Other first responders were arriving now. More fire trucks, another ambulance. The scene was a controlled chaos of professionals at work. But in this small bubble of space around the blue sedan, it was an insane standoff. "I need to see your identification," Riley said, shifting tactics. If he couldn't bully him, he would bog him down in procedure. "My identification is in the ambulance," Marcus said, not looking up. He was now taping down the IV line, his movements swift and sure. "You are welcome to verify my credentials with my partner or through your dispatch. But I am not stopping treatment of a dying woman to show you my driver's license." "So you're refusing to identify yourself?" "I'm refusing to abandon my patient," Marcus corrected him. "There's a difference. Sarah, let's get the backboard. We need to extricate her now. Her pressure is still dropping." He and Sarah moved as one, preparing for the delicate, coordinated movement of sliding a backboard under the patient to lift her from the car. It was a critical, painstaking process. As they positioned their hands, Officer Riley moved. He didn't grab him, not yet. He stepped directly into the space between Marcus and the car door, blocking his path. His body was a physical barrier. "You are obstructing my investigation," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Marcus looked up from his patient. His own deep well of patience, honed on battlefields and in the back of ambulances, finally running dry. His anger was a cold, sharp thing. "And you are obstructing emergency medical care. This woman is my only priority. Now get out of my way." For a tense, charged moment, they were locked in a stalemate. A paramedic on his knees, hands ready to save a life. A police officer on his feet, arms crossed, the symbol of the law becoming an obstacle to that life. The heat from the asphalt shimmered around them, magnifying the intensity of the standoff. The other emergency workers were starting to notice, their heads turning, the rhythm of their own work faltering as they sensed the unnatural conflict. "Officer, for God's sake, let him work!" a firefighter shouted from across the wreckage. Riley's head snapped toward the firefighter. "You stay out of this or you'll be next!" he yelled, pointing a finger, his authority now challenged on a second front. That split-second diversion was all Marcus needed. He refocused on the patient. "Sarah, on my count. 1, 2... He never got to 3. As he shifted his weight to begin the delicate process of moving the patient onto the backboard, Riley's hand clamped down on his upper arm. The grip was like iron, a sudden, shocking violation that sent a jolt through Marcus's body. "I told you to stop," Riley growled, his face hidden behind the sunglasses now inches from Marcus's. "You don't get to decide what happens here. I do." The world seemed to slow down. The feel of the officer's fingers digging into his biceps, the sight of his patient's pale, slack-jawed face, the sound of Sarah's sharp intake of breath. This was it. A line had been crossed. This was no longer a jurisdictional squabble. This was a direct, physical assault on his ability to perform his job and, by extension, a direct threat to his patient's life. Marcus looked from Riley's hand on his arm up to the mirrored sunglasses, which reflected a distorted fisheye image of his own face, his expression a mask of cold, controlled fury. "Take your hand off me, officer," Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You are interfering with a life-saving procedure." "You're under arrest," Riley declared, the words booming with a sense of finality and triumph. He seemed to relish saying them, the ultimate expression of his power. The statement was so absurd, so completely divorced from the reality of the situation, that for a moment Marcus could only stare at him in stunned disbelief. Arrested? For what? For refusing to let a woman bleed to death on the side of a highway. Sarah froze, half-crouched over the patient, her face a canvas of disbelief. "Arrested for what?" Marcus demanded, pulling his arm from Riley's grasp with a sharp, decisive movement. He immediately turned back to his patient, placing his hands back in position. "Sarah, we are moving her. Now!" He was done talking. He was done negotiating with this man's fragile ego. A life was on the line, and he would not let Officer Nolan Riley be the one to end it. But as he and Sarah tensed to lift, Riley acted. He grabbed Marcus again, not by the arm this time, but by the shoulder of his turnout coat, and violently yanked him backward. Marcus, caught off balance, stumbled away from the car. His heavy jump bag, which had been open on the ground beside him, tipped over, its meticulously organized contents spilling across the dirty asphalt. Syringes, gauze pads, medication vials, IV bags, the tools of his trade, scattered like discarded toys under the harsh sun. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting a law enforcement officer," Riley shouted, his voice ringing with victory. He spun Marcus around with surprising force, wrenching his arms behind his back. The cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs closed around his wrists. The sharp click, click, click as the ratchet tightened was the loudest sound Marcus had ever heard. It was a sound of finality, of utter insanity. It was the sound of a world turned upside down, where a paramedic trying to save a life was treated like a violent felon. The bite of the metal into his skin was a sharp, grounding pain in the midst of the surreal chaos. "My patient!" Marcus cried out, his professional composure finally shattering. His voice was raw with desperation as he twisted his head to look back. He could see her through the open car door, unattended. "Sarah, don't stop! You have to get her out!" Snapped out of her shock by his plea, Sarah immediately scrambled back to the patient's side. Her hands, though shaking with adrenaline and rage, moved with purpose, checking the woman's vitals, adjusting the tourniquet. She was alone now, one paramedic trying to do the work of two, her efforts hampered by the very person who was supposed to be helping them. The scene erupted. The firefighters and other paramedics who had been hesitant witnesses were now an angry chorus. They moved forward, shouting at Riley, their phones suddenly held high, recording every second of the outrage. "What the hell are you doing? She's crashing, you idiot! We've got you on camera!" Riley seemed momentarily taken aback by the crowd's reaction, but his jaw hardened. He shoved Marcus toward his patrol car, his hand firmly on his back. "Get back, all of you! Get back now!" he roared at the other first responders. As he forced Marcus away from the car, Marcus's eyes remained locked on his patient, the woman whose life had been in his hands just seconds before. He saw Sarah working desperately, a lone first responder in a sea of chaos. He saw the woman's color worsening, and he knew with a sickening, gut-wrenching certainty that the delay, this insane, pointless, ego-driven delay, was costing her. It was costing her precious time, precious brain cells, precious life. The back of the patrol car was an oven. The vinyl seat stuck to Marcus's uniform, and the handcuffs, cinched tight behind him, dug into his wrists with every slight movement. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing him in a plastic and metal cage. Through the reinforced glass and the metal grate, he watched the scene play out like a silent, horrifying movie. He was a combat medic cuffed in the back of a police car watching a woman die. And the person who had put him there, the one who was supposed to be his partner in these life-or-death situations, stood with his back to the unfolding tragedy, speaking calmly into his radio. Officer Riley hadn't just arrested him, he had abandoned his most fundamental duty. He had prioritized his own perceived authority over a human life. Marcus pressed his face against the hot window, his gaze fixed on the blue sedan. He saw Sarah, her face a mask of frantic concentration, trying to manage the IV line, the backboard, and the patient's airway all at once. One of the firefighters had scrambled over to help her, his movements clumsy but willing. They were trying, but they were losing the battle. He could see it in their desperate motions. They were losing precious minutes. He saw Sarah get on her own radio, her mouth moving frantically. She was likely calling for a supervisor, for another unit, for anyone who could fix this nightmare. The other first responders had formed a loose, protective circle around the patient, their bodies a defiant barrier against the officer who had betrayed their shared mission. They were staring at Riley's car, at Marcus, their faces a mixture of fury and disbelief. This was a violation of a sacred trust, an act so outside the bounds of professional conduct that it was almost incomprehensible. The wail of another approaching siren grew steadily louder, a welcome sound that nonetheless twisted a knot in Marcus's gut. Help was coming, but it was help that should never have been needed. 4 minutes later, an eternity in trauma care, another ambulance screamed onto the shoulder. 2 new paramedics, a man and a woman Marcus vaguely recognized from another station, jumped out and rushed to the scene with their own equipment. There was a frantic, hurried exchange of information. Sarah, still trying to stabilize the patient, pointed from the woman in the car to Marcus, locked in the back of the patrol car. The female paramedic's head whipped around, her eyes widening in confusion and shock as she saw Marcus's face pressed against the glass. The look was a mirror of what he felt, a deep, professional offense. One of us is in handcuffs while a patient is dying. It was the ultimate betrayal. The new crew worked with swift efficiency, a flurry of controlled, expert motion. They finally managed to get the woman onto the backboard and lift her from the car. As they did, Marcus could see her face, ashen and slack. Was she still alive? Was that faint, thready pulse he'd fought so hard to find completely gone? The not knowing was a physical torment, an itch under his skin he couldn't scratch. As they loaded the stretcher into their ambulance, Sarah jogged over to the patrol car. Her face was pale, streaked with sweat and tears of rage. She couldn't open the door, but she leaned close to the window, her voice strained. "They're taking her to Metro General," she said, her voice cracking. "She lost her pulse right after you were... right after. I had to start compressions. They're working her now, but Marcus, it's bad." The words hit him like a physical blow. She had gone into full cardiac arrest. The catastrophe that Riley's intervention had directly precipitated had happened. The delay wasn't theoretical anymore. It was measured in the death of heart cells, in the starvation of a brain, in the potential destruction of a life. "Sarah, you need to call the supervisor, now," Marcus instructed, his voice steady despite the tremor of rage he felt inside. "You need to document everything. The time Riley arrived, the time he first interfered, the time of the arrest, every single second." "Already did," Sarah said, her jaw tight. "The battalion chief is on his way. The whole world is about to come down on this guy's head." The other ambulance pulled away, its lights flashing, its siren cutting a path through the parted traffic. Marcus watched it go until it was just a speck in the distance, carrying away the patient he had been forced to abandon. A profound sense of failure washed over him, hot and suffocating, even though he knew logically that the failure was not his own. Officer Riley finally finished his radio call and climbed into the driver's seat. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes briefly meeting Marcus's in the reflection. There was no remorse in his gaze, no uncertainty, only a cold, self-satisfied hardness. He had enforced his will, and that was all that mattered. He started the engine and pulled away from the scene without a word. The silence in the car was a suffocating blanket. The only sound was the crackle of the police radio, a stream of mundane chatter that felt like it was from another universe. "That woman could die," Marcus said, the words breaking the silence. He needed to say it. He needed him to acknowledge the consequence of his actions. "Because of you. Because you needed to see my ID while she was bleeding out. I hope your ego is worth a woman's life." Riley's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "You should have followed a lawful order," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This is on you. You resisted." Marcus leaned his head back against the hard plastic seat and closed his eyes. It was useless. Arguing with him was like arguing with a brick wall. He was insulated by his badge, by his own certainty, by a system that had clearly taught him that his authority was absolute. But as they drove, his training kicked in. Not his paramedic training, but the training from his time in the service. Assess the situation. Identify the threat. Formulate a plan. The threat was no longer his patient's failing heart. The threat was Officer Nolan Riley and the department that stood behind him. And his plan, which was forming with crystalline clarity, was not just to survive this. It was to burn it all to the ground. The city's central booking facility was a place Marcus had only ever seen from the other side of the divide. A monolithic concrete structure that hummed with a low-grade misery. It was where he and Sarah often brought intoxicated individuals or people suffering mental health crises who needed to be medically cleared before being jailed. He had always been the respected professional in a clean uniform, a partner in the city's complex ecosystem of emergency services. Now he was being led through the sally port in handcuffs, the heavy steel doors clanging shut behind him, each clang echoing the finality of his new reality. He was no longer a provider. He was property of the system. Officer Riley gripped his arm, steering him through the corridors as if he were a common criminal. The air inside was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. Officers at their desks looked up as they passed, their conversations faltering. Their eyes registered his paramedic uniform first, then the handcuffs, and a wave of confusion and curiosity rippled through the room. A medic in cuffs was not a common sight. It was a disruption to the natural order of things. Riley pushed him toward the booking desk, a high counter presided over by a world-weary-looking sergeant, a stout man in his 50s with a salt-and-pepper mustache and a nameplate that read, Kowalski. "Got one for booking," Riley announced, his voice unnecessarily loud, projecting for the audience he had created. "Obstruction and resisting." Sergeant Kowalski looked up from his paperwork, his gaze falling on Marcus, then on Riley. He raised a skeptical eyebrow, his eyes lingering on Marcus's uniform. "Resisting what? A heart attack?" he asked, his voice a low grumble. He looked back at Marcus. "I know you. You're Thorne from Station 15. You brought in that jumper from the bridge last month. What in God's name is going on, Riley?" "He refused to follow a lawful order at an active scene," Riley said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Interfered with my investigation." "What investigation?" Kowalski pressed, his tone sharp. The sergeant had been on the job for 30 years. He could smell a bad arrest from a mile away, and this one reeked. "He was on a multi-car pileup on I-95. I heard the chatter, multiple criticals. What exactly did he obstruct? The patient's bleeding?" The sarcasm was thick, and a few officers within earshot chuckled. Riley's face flushed a deep red. "He refused to provide identification and became belligerent." "Sergeant, I was treating a critical trauma patient with a femoral artery bleed," Marcus interjected, his voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to Riley's defensive bluster. "I informed the officer that I would provide my credentials as soon as the patient was stabilized for transport. Her life was the priority." Kowalski's eyes narrowed, looking from Marcus's resolute face to Riley's defensive one. "You pulled a medic away from a woman bleeding out on the highway to ask for his driver's license," he asked Riley, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "Is that what you're telling me?" "I was securing the scene," Riley insisted, but his voice had lost some of its swagger. Kowalski just shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. He turned to the booking officer. "Process him, and be quick about it. Get his union rep on the phone." He shot a final withering glare at Riley. "My office, now!" The booking process was a systematic stripping away of dignity. Marcus's fingerprints were taken, the black ink smearing on his skin, a stark symbol of his new classification. A mugshot was taken, the harsh flash of the camera capturing his exhausted but defiant expression. He was instructed to remove his personal belongings, his wallet, which contained his driver's license and his paramedic certifications, his phone, his watch. Each item was placed in a clear plastic bag and cataloged with bureaucratic indifference. The irony was suffocating. The very identification Riley had deemed more important than a woman's life was now being handled as evidence of his supposed crime. The young officer handling the booking seemed deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation. He handled Marcus's credentials with a reverence that bordered on apology. 20 years as a medic, decorated Army vet, critical care certified, he muttered, reading from the IDs as he logged them. He looked up at Marcus, his eyes full of a conflict he couldn't hide. "Sir, are the cuffs too tight? Did you sustain any injuries during the arrest?" "I'm fine," Marcus replied, his voice flat. "But you should ask my patient that question." The one your colleague prevented me from treating. The officer flinched and quickly looked down, focusing on his paperwork. Through a nearby office door, Marcus could hear the muffled but heated sounds of Sergeant Kowalski's voice, rising and falling in a controlled fury as he dressed down Officer Riley. The words weren't clear, but the tone was. Riley wasn't being praised, he was being grilled. After the paperwork was complete, the officer led him down a short hallway to a holding cell. The heavy metal door slid open with a groan. "I'm sorry, sir. It'll just be until we can get things sorted out." The door slammed shut, and the lock engaged with a deafening clang. Marcus was alone. The cell was small, cold, and brutally simple. A concrete bench and a toilet. He sat down, the cold of the bench seeping through his uniform. For the first time since the call came in, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a profound sense of violation. He had dedicated his life to helping people, to being the calm in the storm. And for doing his job, for doing what was right, he had been locked in a cage. He put his head in his hands, not in despair, but in a quiet, simmering rage. This was more than just a bad cop having a bad day. This was a systemic failure, and he was going to hold the system accountable. Time in the holding cell was a thick, syrupy thing that refused to move. Marcus measured its passage by the changing shifts of light through the small, high window and the distant, muffled sounds of the station. He heard phones ringing, officers laughing, the routine hum of a world that had not stopped for his injustice. Each minute that passed felt like an accusation, a fresh layer of insult on the injury. He replayed the encounter with Riley in his mind, dissecting every word, every action. Could he have handled it differently? Should he have been more compliant, shown him the ID and hoped for the best? The answer every time was a resolute no. Compliance would have been a betrayal of his patient. It would have meant conceding that a police officer's demand for paperwork superseded a paramedic's duty to save a life. It was a principle he would not, could not, surrender. But the cost of that principle was this: a cold, concrete bench and the gnawing uncertainty about the fate of the woman from the blue sedan. He'd been in the cell for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 90 minutes, when he heard footsteps approaching. Not the heavy, purposeful tread of a uniformed officer, but a quicker, more energetic cadence. A woman in a tailored gray pantsuit stopped in front of his cell door. She was in her late 40s, a black woman with a sharp, intelligent face, hair cut in a short, no-nonsense style, and eyes that seemed to assess everything in a single, sweeping glance. She carried a leather briefcase that looked both expensive and well-used. "Marcus Thorne?" she asked, her voice calm and confident, a welcome sound in the oppressive quiet. Marcus stood up and walked to the bars. "Yes. My name is Evelyn Reed. I'm an attorney with the Paramedics Union. Your partner Sarah called your supervisor, and your supervisor called me. I came as fast as I could." She offered a small, reassuring smile that didn't quite reach her intense eyes. "Let's get you out of here." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees washed over Marcus. He wasn't alone anymore. The system he had dedicated his life to was now fighting for him. "Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," Reed said, already pulling a legal pad and a pen from her briefcase. "I've already had a spirited conversation with Sergeant Kowalski. He's on our side, but his hands are tied. The arrest report has been filed. Officer Riley is doubling down, claiming you were aggressive and non-compliant. We need to build our case, starting right now. I want you to tell me everything that happened, from the moment you got the call. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small." Marcus began his story with the precision of a trained medical professional reporting a patient's history. He recounted the entire event: the dispatch call, the patient's condition, his initial assessment, the femoral bleed. Then he described Officer Riley's arrival, his tone, his posture, his immediate demands. He detailed his repeated attempts to explain the medical urgency, Riley's refusal to listen, his escalation, the physical assault, and the arrest. Reed listened intently, her pen flying across the page, her expression growing grimmer with every word. She would occasionally interrupt with a sharp, clarifying question. Did he ever state what crime he was investigating? No, just that it was a potential crime scene and he needed to secure it. Did he ask about the patient's condition? Did he show any concern for the woman's well-being? None, Marcus said, the word tasting like ash. His only concern was establishing his authority and seeing my ID. And you told him where your ID was? I told him it was in the ambulance, and he could verify my credentials with my partner or dispatch, but that I would not stop active treatment of a critical patient. Reed nodded, a grim satisfaction on her face. That's perfect. You established a clear willingness to comply once the exigent medical circumstance was resolved. His refusal to accept that is key. She looked up from her notes. Marcus, what he did wasn't just a bad judgment call. It was illegal. State law is crystal clear on the issue of interfering with emergency medical personnel. The arrest was unlawful from the moment he laid hands on you. She closed her notepad. They'll release you within the hour. The charges of obstruction and resisting are baseless. They won't even make it to a prosecutor's desk. This is a classic case of what we call contempt of cop, and it's not a real crime. Riley arrested you because you challenged his authority, not because you broke the law. What about my patient? Marcus asked, the question that had been tormenting him for hours. Do you know anything? Reed's expression softened, the hard edge of the lawyer momentarily replaced by something more compassionate. Sarah gave me an update. The patient's name is Eleanor Vance. She was transported to Metro General. She went into full cardiac arrest at the scene, as you feared. They were performing CPR on her in the ambulance. She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. She was alive when they arrived at the ER, but the trauma surgeon called it touch and go. The prolonged lack of blood flow to her brain is the main concern now. The next few hours are critical. She met his gaze directly. The delay in transport, it's going to be a major factor in this case. If the worst happens, this goes from being an unlawful arrest to a potential wrongful death suit. The city knows that. They're already in damage control mode. True to Reed's word, the cell door slid open 40 minutes later. Sergeant Kowalski was standing there, his expression stern. You're being released on your own recognizance, Thorne. The charges are being reviewed, but I don't expect them to stick. He handed Marcus the plastic bag with his belongings. For what it's worth, he said, his voice low, I'm sorry this happened. He was out of line. Marcus just nodded, taking his property. The apology was a small concession, but it was something. As he walked out of the station with Evelyn Reed at his side, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, he felt like he was surfacing after being held underwater. He was free, but he wasn't whole. A part of him was still back on that highway, fighting for a life that had been needlessly endangered. And another part of him was now steeling itself for the bigger fight to come. This wasn't over. It had just begun. Sarah was waiting for him in the parking lot, leaning against the side of their ambulance, which she'd retrieved from the impound lot. Her uniform was rumpled, and her face was etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She straightened up as soon as she saw him, rushing forward to pull him into a firm, sisterly hug. Marcus, my God, are you okay? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. I've been better, he said, pulling back. Tell me about Eleanor Vance. What's the latest? Sarah's face clouded over. She took a deep breath. It's bad, really bad. I stayed at the hospital until they took her into surgery. The neurologist came out to talk to her husband. She hesitated, struggling to find the words. Marcus, she survived the surgery. They repaired the artery, but she was without a pulse for too long on the scene. The lack of oxygen. She had a massive stroke. They don't know the extent of the damage yet, but they're talking about paralysis, loss of speech. They said she'll never be the same. The words landed like stones in Marcus's stomach. Every paramedic lives with the fear of losing a patient, but this was different. This wasn't a loss to an injury that was too severe or a disease that was too advanced. This was a loss to a man's ego. Those precious minutes Riley had stolen from them, while he postured and demanded and finally arrested him, were the minutes Eleanor Vance's brain was dying. The image of Riley's smug, sunglass-hidden face flashed in his mind, and his simmering anger ignited into a white-hot flame. "Her family?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. "Her husband and 2 adult kids are there. They're devastated. They know what happened. A couple of the firefighters who were on scene stayed and told them everything. Her husband, he's talking to a lawyer." Evelyn Reed, who had been standing back to give them a moment, stepped forward. Her expression was grim. "This confirms our path forward," she said. "The harm is no longer theoretical. We have a direct, documented, and catastrophic consequence of Officer Riley's actions. We're no longer just talking about your civil rights being violated, Marcus. We're talking about a woman who will be permanently disabled because a police officer couldn't handle being told no by a black man who was trying to save her life." They drove to Reed's office, a sleek, modern space in a downtown high-rise that felt a world away from the grit of the holding cell. For the next 3 hours, Marcus gave a formal, recorded statement. Reed's team was already at work, a whirlwind of focused energy. They were filing motions, contacting witnesses, and drafting the initial complaint. A paralegal brought in sworn affidavits from 2 of the firefighters and another paramedic who had been on the scene. They were all furious, their professional outrage clear in the cold, legal language of their statements. They all corroborated Marcus's account. A paramedic providing critical care, a police officer escalating a non-existent conflict, and a patient paying the price. "The city's first move will be to try and discredit you," Reed explained as they reviewed the evidence. "They'll dig into your record, your personal life, anything they can find to paint you as an unstable, insubordinate hothead. But they're going to come up empty." She tapped a folder on her desk. "I've already pulled your file. 12 years decorated service in the Army, including a commendation for valor. Nearly 15 years as a paramedic with 0 disciplinary actions against you. You are, for lack of a better term, the perfect plaintiff." She pointed to a paragraph in the draft of the lawsuit. "We are filing a federal lawsuit under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act. We will argue that Officer Riley, acting under the color of law, deprived you of your 4th Amendment rights against unlawful seizure and your 14th Amendment right to due process. Furthermore, we are adding state-level claims for intentional interference with emergency medical care, false arrest, and battery." She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze intense. "We will be suing Officer Riley individually and the city for failure to train and supervise its officers. We are not just going after the soldier, we are going after the army that sent him into battle unprepared." The lawsuit was filed electronically at 9 a.m. the next morning. It was an explosive document, detailing in cold, legal language the horrifying events of the previous day. It named Officer Nolan Riley and the city as defendants and sought unspecified damages for the violation of Marcus's civil rights, emotional distress, and the catastrophic harm done to Eleanor Vance as a direct result of his actions. Within an hour, the media storm began. The story was perfect for the 24-hour news cycle, a combustible cocktail of heroism, injustice, and abuse of power. A hero paramedic, a decorated black veteran, arrested by a young white cop while saving a woman's life. It was a narrative that tapped into a deep well of public frustration with law enforcement overreach. The witness videos, which had been sent to a local news station by one of the firefighters, went viral. The shaky smartphone footage was damning. It clearly showed Marcus providing medical care. It captured Riley's aggressive demands. And it recorded the moment he physically pulled Marcus off the patient and cuffed him. The image of Marcus in his uniform being forced into the back of a patrol car while his patient lay unattended was broadcast across the country. His phone, which he'd gotten back with his other belongings, began to light up with calls and texts from friends, family, and colleagues from across the state, all expressing their shock and support. The fire department and the paramedics union issued statements standing firmly behind Marcus, calling his actions heroic and in accordance with the highest standards of patient care. The police department, in contrast, issued a terse defensive statement saying the incident was under internal investigation and that Officer Riley had been placed on administrative desk duty. The battle lines had been drawn. Marcus, with the backing of his union and Evelyn Reed, stood on one side. On the other stood Officer Riley and a city bureaucracy that would now go to extraordinary lengths to protect itself and its employee from the consequences of his actions. The lawsuit wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war, a war Marcus had never asked for, but one he was now fully committed to winning. For Marcus, life became surreal. He was on paid leave from the job he loved, a job that was as much a part of his identity as his own name. He spent his days in meetings with lawyers instead of responding to 911 calls. The quiet routine of his life had been shattered, replaced by the constant hum of media attention. He tried to keep a low profile, but his face was everywhere. He'd be recognized at the grocery store, with strangers stopping him to shake his hand and thank him for standing up. The attention was uncomfortable, but it strengthened his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Eleanor Vance, who was lying in a hospital bed, her life irrevocably altered. He was fighting for every paramedic who had ever been bullied or impeded by an officer on a power trip. Evelyn Reed used the intense media scrutiny to their advantage. She was a master strategist, orchestrating the public narrative with the same precision Marcus used to treat a patient. "They are feeling the pressure," she told him during one of their strategy sessions. "The police chief is getting hammered at press conferences. The mayor's office is being flooded with angry calls. They want this to go away." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "Which means they're going to try to settle. They're going to make us an offer to shut us up. It will probably be a significant number, but you need to be prepared for what that means. It will come with a non-disclosure agreement. They'll pay for your silence." Marcus thought about that. He thought about taking the money, putting this nightmare behind him and trying to go back to his life. But then he thought about Eleanor Vance. He thought about the fact that Officer Riley was still an employee of the city, still drawing a paycheck. He thought about the system that had allowed a man like Riley to wear a badge and carry a gun. Silence felt like a betrayal. "What about Riley's record?" Marcus asked. "Can we find out if he's done this before?" Reed smiled, a thin, sharp smile. "That's what the discovery phase is for," she said. "It's where they have to turn over everything. Riley's complete personnel file, all citizen complaints against him, all internal emails and memos related to the incident, and most importantly, the one piece of evidence that will decide this case." She paused for effect. "The unedited, high-definition footage from Officer Riley's body camera." She leaned back in her chair. "Riley thinks his report will protect him. The city thinks their lawyers can spin this. But the camera doesn't spin. It just shows. And what it's going to show a jury is a hero trying to save a life, and a bully with a badge who was willing to let a woman be permanently disabled to prove a point." In the world of high-stakes litigation, the first move from a defendant like a city is often a test of resolve. 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, Evelyn Reed received a call from the city attorney's office. It was the call she had been expecting. "They want to talk settlement," she told Marcus over the phone. "They're trying to gauge how serious we are, to see if we'll bite at the first offer and go away quietly." "What are they offering?" Marcus asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He was sitting at his kitchen table, staring out the window at a world that felt both familiar and alien. Reed let out a short, humorless laugh. "You should sit down for this. They're offering to pay your legal fees and give you $50,000 for your trouble. They called it a nuisance value settlement." Marcus was silent for a moment, processing the sheer audacity of the offer. $50,000. It wasn't a settlement, it was an insult. It was the monetary equivalent of a pat on the head, a pittance meant to make the problem go away before it got too expensive or embarrassing. It was an offer made by people who saw this not as a gross violation of rights and a near-fatal dereliction of duty, but as a public relations inconvenience to be managed. It was an offer that placed the value of his ordeal, his humiliation, and Eleanor Vance's shattered life at a mere $50,000. "Tell them no," Marcus said, his voice laced with ice. "Tell them I'll see them in court." "That's what I thought you'd say," Reed replied, a note of pride in her voice. "I already told them their offer was offensive and that our next conversation would be during depositions. This was their gambit. They were hoping you were just looking for a quick payday, that the pressure and the media attention would make you fold." She paused. "They misjudged you, Marcus. They misjudged you badly." They had. The city's lawyers and risk managers had made a critical error. They had mistaken Marcus's quiet, professional demeanor for weakness. They didn't understand that his fight was no longer just about his own vindication. It had become about Eleanor Vance. Her condition had stabilized, but the diagnosis was devastating. The stroke had left her with severe aphasia, the inability to speak or understand language, and paralysis on the right side of her body. She was 58 years old, a grandmother, an active member of her community. Now she was trapped inside her own mind, her life permanently, catastrophically altered because of a 7-minute delay on the side of a highway. Her family had retained their own lawyer and were preparing a separate multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the city. The two cases, while legally distinct, were inextricably linked. Every victory for Marcus would be a victory for Eleanor. The city's refusal to take his lawsuit seriously had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of silencing him, it galvanized him. And when news of the nuisance value offer leaked to the press, a strategic leak from Reed's office, the story exploded with renewed fury. Editorials were written condemning the city's callousness. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a textbook example of police overreach and municipal arrogance. A GoFundMe page started by Marcus's paramedic station to help with any uncovered expenses was flooded with donations from strangers across the country. Paramedics from as far away as California and New York sent messages of solidarity. He had become an unwilling symbol for every first responder who had ever been bullied, questioned, or impeded by a law enforcement officer on a power trip. The pressure on the city mounted. The police chief held a press conference where he was hammered with questions about Officer Riley's disciplinary record. It was revealed that Riley, in his short 6-year career, had accumulated over a dozen citizen complaints for excessive force and abuse of authority, none of which had resulted in any significant disciplinary action. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a problem the department had ignored until it blew up in their faces on a national stage. This revelation was a turning point. It shifted the narrative from a single bad incident to a pattern of behavior, a systemic failure of accountability. The city hadn't just employed a bad apple, they had cultivated a rotten tree. Evelyn Reed seized on the information. "This isn't just about one officer anymore," she told Marcus. "This is about a department that repeatedly failed to police its own. They knew Riley was a problem and they did nothing. That's not just negligence. It's a deliberate indifference to the rights of the citizens they are sworn to protect. And that," she said, her eyes glinting, "is going to cost them far more than $50,000. The city had wanted to quietly sweep their mess under the rug. Instead, they had handed Evelyn Reed a much bigger broom. The discovery process in a federal lawsuit is a slow, methodical grinding of legal gears, a battle fought not in a courtroom, but through a relentless exchange of documents and data. For months, Evelyn Reed's office was inundated with thousands of pages from the city, training manuals, internal affairs reports, policy guidelines, and Officer Riley's complete, unredacted personnel file. Marcus spent days with Reed and her team, poring over the documents. It was tedious, emotionally draining work. Reading through Riley's file was like reading the biography of a bully. It was filled with complaints from citizens detailing his arrogance, his quick temper, his tendency to escalate minor situations into physical confrontations. In each case, his superiors had sided with him, dismissing the complaints as unfounded or unsubstantiated. It was a clear, documented pattern of a department protecting one of its own at all costs. "They're not just protecting him," Reed observed, tapping a thick stack of papers. "They're creating him. Every time they cleared him of wrongdoing, they sent him a message. Your behavior is acceptable. Your aggression is justified. Keep doing what you're doing." But all of it, the personnel file, the policy manuals, the internal memos, was secondary to the single digital file they had been waiting for. It arrived on a password-protected hard drive delivered by a court courier. It was the unedited, full-length body camera footage from Officer Nolan Riley, from the moment he arrived at the scene to the moment Marcus was placed in the holding cell. Reed had it set up in a conference room on a large monitor. Marcus sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Sarah was there too for support and to corroborate the sequence of events. "Are you ready for this?" Reed asked him gently. Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. "Play it." The video began with a jarring, unsteady view of the ground as Officer Riley got out of his patrol car. The audio was crystal clear. The roar of the highway, the crackle of his radio. Then he began walking toward the scene. The camera's perspective was his own, an unnerving first-person view of the confrontation to come. He approached the circle of wreckage, his voice already sharp. "What's going on here? Everybody back up!" Then the camera centered on him. A version of Marcus kneeling beside the blue sedan, his back to the camera, completely engrossed in his patient. The footage was visceral, immediate. It captured the gray, sweaty pallor of Eleanor Vance's skin, the shallow, desperate gasps for air she was taking. It was obvious to anyone, medically trained or not, that she was in extreme distress. The audio was even more damning than Marcus remembered. "I need this entire area cleared out," Riley's voice commanded, cold and devoid of any empathy. "I'm a paramedic," his own voice replied, calm and focused. "I have a critical patient here." The camera showed Marcus not even looking up, his hands moving with purpose, applying the tourniquet. The footage perfectly corroborated his story. His attention was, and remained, on saving a life. "I don't care who you are," Riley's voice repeated, louder this time. The camera tilted up as Riley stepped closer, looming over the scene. It captured Marcus's quick professional explanation of the medical situation. "Officer, with all due respect, my priority right now is keeping this woman alive." Watching it now, from Riley's perspective, was chilling. The camera showed no interest in the patient. It remained fixed on Marcus, the perceived source of defiance. It recorded his clear, concise explanations of the medical emergency and his lawful duty. It recorded his offer to have his credentials verified by other means. It recorded the moment he dismissed Riley to continue his work. Then came the escalation. The camera lurched as Riley stepped forward to block him. His voice, captured by the microphone inches from his mouth, was a low growl. "You are obstructing my investigation." His own reply was just as clear. "And you are obstructing emergency medical care." The most crucial moment was the arrest itself. The video showed Riley grabbing his arm. It showed him yanking Marcus away from the patient. The camera swung wildly, capturing the medical kits spilling across the ground. Then the view became a chaotic jumble of Marcus's back and the sky as Riley spun him around and forced his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic clicks of the handcuffs were picked up with perfect clarity by the microphone. The video continued for another 20 minutes. It showed the angry shouts of the other first responders. It showed Sarah, her face a mask of desperation, taking over CPR. It showed the arrival of the second ambulance. And it showed the long, silent walk back to the patrol car where Marcus was placed in the back like a piece of cargo. When the video ended, the conference room was silent. Sarah was shaking her head, her face pale. Marcus felt strangely numb, vindicated but also sickened. It was all there. Every lie in Riley's report, every self-serving statement the city had made, was obliterated by this single, unblinking recording of the truth. Evelyn Reed sat back in her chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across her face. She hit the spacebar on the keyboard, and the final frame, A view of Marcus's face through the grated partition of the patrol car froze on the screen. The silence in the conference room was profound, broken only by the low hum of the projector. "In 25 years of practicing law," she said, her voice quiet with awe, "I have never seen a more powerful or more damning piece of evidence. That camera didn't just record an unlawful arrest, it recorded a man's soul. It recorded his arrogance, his insecurity, and his utter disregard for human life." She stood up and began to pace the room, energized, her legal mind already 5 steps ahead. "Their entire strategy was to paint you as the aggressor, to argue that you were belligerent and uncooperative, that Riley was forced to act to maintain control of a chaotic scene." She gestured emphatically at the frozen image on the screen. "This video proves you were the only person in that interaction who remained calm, professional, and focused on the job at hand. Riley wasn't a cop maintaining order. He was a bully who couldn't handle a black man telling him he had more important things to do than stroke his ego." Sarah finally spoke, her voice shaking with residual anger. "It's worse than I remembered. Seeing it from his perspective, he never once looked at the patient as a person. She was just an obstacle, an inconvenience in his power play." Marcus just nodded, still processing the surreal experience of watching his own assault from his attacker's point of view. The camera had captured the subtle things his memory had blurred. The aggressive forward lean of Riley's body, the way he shifted his weight onto the balls of his feet like a fighter before he moved in. The complete lack of any attempt at de-escalation. The officer's report had claimed that Marcus was agitated and posed a potential threat. The video showed a man on his knees, his voice steady, his hands occupied with saving a life. The report was not just a misinterpretation, it was a fabrication, a work of fiction designed to justify the unjustifiable. "This changes everything," Evelyn continued, her voice sharp with strategic focus. "The city's lawyers will see this footage and they will know their case is unwinnable. They will come back to the table with a real settlement offer, a 7-figure offer. They will do anything to keep this video from being shown to a jury." She stopped pacing and looked at the blank screen, then turned to Marcus, her eyes glinting. "But we're not going to let them bury it. We're not going to take their money and sign a non-disclosure agreement. We're going to show this video to 12 ordinary citizens. We're going to put Officer Nolan Riley on the witness stand, make him watch it, and make him explain every single second of it under oath." A fierce sense of purpose settled over Marcus, dispelling the numbness that had gripped him. Evelyn was right. A quiet settlement would vindicate him financially, but it wouldn't change anything. It would allow the city to handle the problem internally, to fire Riley perhaps, but to leave the system that produced him completely intact. The public, the other paramedics, the future victims of other officers like Riley, they would never know the full truth. The video was more than just evidence in his lawsuit. It was proof of a systemic disease. It needed to be seen. "This case is no longer about getting you a settlement, Marcus," Evelyn said, echoing his thoughts. "It's about getting you justice. The kind of justice that changes laws. The kind of justice that protects the next paramedic who has to deal with the next Officer Riley." The deposition was scheduled for 3 weeks later. A deposition is not a trial. There is no judge, no jury. It takes place in the sterile confines of a law firm's conference room. But in many ways, it is more grueling. It is a slow, methodical dissection of a witness's story, designed to lock them into a version of events they cannot later change, and to expose every weakness, every contradiction, every lie. Officer Nolan Riley walked into the deposition room flanked by 2 attorneys from the city. He wore his uniform, crisp and pressed, his posture ramrod straight. He carried himself with the same air of unshakable confidence he'd had on the highway. He was there to defend his actions, to project the image of a decisive officer who had been forced to take control of a chaotic scene from an uncooperative paramedic. He believed his badge, his report, and his version of the story would protect him. He was wrong. For the first hour, one of the city's attorneys led Officer Riley through his own testimony, allowing him to construct his narrative in the calm, controlled environment of the conference room. He described arriving at a disorderly and hazardous scene. He recounted his attempts to secure the area for the safety of all personnel. He painted Marcus as immediately hostile and belligerent, a paramedic who refused to comply with lawful orders. He presented himself as the calm center of a storm, a professional doing his job under difficult circumstances. He spoke with confidence, his answers crisp and well-rehearsed. He was building a wall, brick by brick, using the language of police reports and procedural manuals. Then it was Evelyn Reed's turn. She began calmly, her questions simple and direct. "Officer Riley, you've been with the department for 6 years, is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am. And in that time, have you received training on interacting with other first responders at emergency scenes?" "Yes, ma'am. We receive extensive training on interagency cooperation." "And does that training instruct you that the immediate life-saving care of a patient is the top priority at a medical emergency?" Riley shifted in his seat, the first sign of discomfort. "My priority is to secure the scene for the safety of everyone involved." "That wasn't my question, officer," Evelyn said, her voice still mild but with a new edge of precision. "Does your training instruct you that a paramedic's active treatment of a critical patient takes precedence over administrative requests, like asking for identification?" The city's attorney objected, "Calls for a legal conclusion," but Evelyn just smiled. "Let me rephrase. At any point did you believe the patient, Mrs. Vance, was not in serious medical distress?" "I am not a medical professional," Riley said stiffly. "I could not make that assessment." "Exactly," Evelyn pounced, the trap sprung. "You are not a medical professional, yet you felt qualified to order the actual medical professional on scene to stop providing care. Is that correct?" "I ordered him to step back so I could secure the scene." Evelyn nodded slowly, then turned to her paralegal. "Please play the first video exhibit. Body camera footage of Officer Riley, timestamp 14:08 to 16:12. The large monitor at the end of the conference table flickered to life. The deposition room was filled with the sounds of the highway, and the video began. Evelyn had Riley watch the first 2 minutes, showing his arrival and his initial aggressive demands. "Officer," Evelyn said, pausing the video just after Riley had yelled, "I don't care who you are!" At this point, you had been on scene for less than 30 seconds. You had not spoken to any witnesses. You had not assessed any potential threats. Yet you decided the most important action you could take was to stop the paramedic from treating his patient. Why? "I was establishing control of the scene," Riley repeated, the words sounding hollow now, a mantra losing its power. "Control over what exactly? A man on his knees trying to save a woman's life?" Evelyn let the question hang in the air before playing the next segment, the one where Marcus calmly explained the patient's condition. She paused it again. "Officer, on this video we can hear paramedic Thorne, a 15-year veteran with an exemplary record, telling you the patient had a femoral bleed and was in danger of bleeding out. Did you understand the severity of that injury?" Riley hesitated. "I have basic first aid training." "So you understood it was a life-threatening hemorrhage, and yet your response was not to ask how you could help. It was not to clear the area for him. It was to repeatedly order him to stop. Is that right?" "It is standard procedure to secure a scene before treatment continues." "Is it standard procedure to arrest a paramedic for prioritizing his dying patient over your request for his driver's license?" Evelyn's voice was rising now, losing its gentle tone and taking on a hard, prosecutorial edge. For the next 4 hours, she dismantled Riley's story, piece by piece, using his own camera footage as the wrecking ball. She forced him to watch himself yank Marcus away from the patient. "Please describe for the record what is happening in this video, officer." Riley stared at the screen, his face pale, his confidence visibly crumbling. "I am effecting an arrest." "You are physically assaulting a licensed paramedic and preventing him from rendering aid," Evelyn corrected him. "Did you see the medical kit spill onto the ground?" Did you see the patient, Mrs. Vance, left unattended while you focused on handcuffing Mr. Thorne? By the end of the deposition, Nolan Riley was a changed man. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defensive silence. His carefully constructed narrative of a hero cop had been exposed as a self-serving fantasy. The official transcript would show him to be evasive, argumentative, and ultimately unable to provide a single credible justification for his actions. He had walked into the room a confident officer of the law. He walked out a man who knew his career was over. The city's attorneys knew it too. Their faces were grim. They had built their entire defense around the testimony of their officer, and Evelyn Reed had just reduced that testimony to rubble. The unblinking eye of the camera, combined with her relentless questioning, had left them with nothing. Their star witness had just become their biggest liability. The day after the deposition, Evelyn Reed's phone rang. It was the lead counsel for the city. The tone was no longer dismissive or condescending. It was the sound of defeat. They wanted to settle. "They know the deposition was a disaster," Evelyn told Marcus later that day in her office. "They know what that body camera footage will do to a jury. They're no longer talking about nuisance value." She slid a piece of paper across her desk. On it was a number, $1,500,000. Marcus stared at the figure. It was an incredible amount of money, a life-changing sum. It was an admission of guilt, a clear signal that the city knew it had no legal leg to stand on. A year's salary for him was around $70,000. This was more than 20 times that. It was enough to pay off his mortgage, set up college funds for his kids, and live without financial worry for years. It was everything the city had said his ordeal wasn't worth, and then some. Part of him, the tired part that had been living this nightmare for months, wanted to say yes. He wanted it to be over. He wanted to stop the endless meetings, the media attention, the gnawing anxiety of the impending trial. He wanted to go back to his life, to his ambulance, to the simple, profound work of saving people. "What do you think?" he asked Evelyn, his voice quiet. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "From almost financial perspective, it's a very strong offer. We could probably push them higher, but this is in the ballpark of a major victory without the risk and stress of a trial. If you take this, you walk away with financial security, and we can get them to expunge the arrest record as part of the deal. No one would blame you for taking it." She paused, her gaze steady. "But you didn't come to me for a purely financial perspective. You came to me for justice." Justice. The word hung in the air between them. Was this justice? A check and a quiet end to the affair. Officer Riley would likely be fired, but the system that created him, the policies that enabled him, would remain unchanged. The next Officer Riley in another city, on another highway, could do the very same thing to another paramedic. The money would fix his problems, but it wouldn't fix the problem. He thought about Eleanor Vance, who was beginning a long, painful rehabilitation, her life forever diminished. He thought about the messages of support he'd received from EMTs and paramedics across the country, stories of their own run-ins with police, of being bullied and threatened. This wasn't just his fight anymore. "This offer comes with a non-disclosure agreement, doesn't it?" Marcus asked. Evelyn nodded. "Of course. It's the most important part for them. They want your silence. They'll pay a premium for it. They want to make sure that body camera footage is never shown in a public court, that Riley's deposition transcript is never released." That was the deal breaker. They wanted to buy his story, to bury the truth he had fought so hard to bring to light. They wanted to pay him to pretend this never happened. "No," Marcus said, the single word firm and clear. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "No deal." A slow smile spread across Evelyn Reed's face. It was the answer she had been hoping for. "I thought you might say that." "This isn't about the money, Evelyn," Marcus continued, leaning forward, his eyes flashing with a fire she hadn't seen before. "It was never about the money. This is about making sure that no paramedic, no EMT, no firefighter ever has to hesitate to treat a patient because they're afraid of the police officer standing over their shoulder. I want that body camera footage shown in court. I want Riley to have to answer for what he did in front of a jury. And I want a verdict that sends a message not just to this city, but to every police department in this country. You do not interfere with medical personnel who are saving a life. Period. His stand was a declaration. He was turning down a fortune for a principle. With settlement talks officially dead, the machinery of the federal court system ground toward a trial date. The first act was jury selection. It was a painstaking process of questioning a pool of ordinary citizens to uncover biases that could influence their judgment. The city's legal team was looking for jurors who were instinctively pro-law enforcement. They asked questions like, do you believe it is a citizen's duty to comply with any order given by a police officer without question? Evelyn's approach was the opposite. She was searching for empathy, for people who could understand the concept of conflicting duties. Her questions were more nuanced. Imagine a situation where a firefighter tells you to evacuate a building because it's on fire, but a police officer tells you to stay put. Whose expertise would you be more inclined to trust regarding the immediate threat to your life? The process took 2 full days. Slowly, methodically, the pool was whittled down. By the end, they had their jury, 12 citizens and 2 alternates. It was a diverse group, a retired teacher, a young software engineer, a union electrician, a stay-at-home mother. Evelyn was pleased. It was not a jury that was inherently anti-police, but it was a jury of thoughtful, independent thinkers. They were people who respected authority but were not blinded by it. They were people who would be able to watch that body camera footage and see the truth. The next morning, the trial would begin. His life, his reputation, and a cause that had become bigger than himself would be placed in the hands of those 12 strangers. The trial began not with Marcus, but with the human cost of Officer Riley's actions. Evelyn Reed's first witness was Robert Vance, Eleanor's husband of 35 years. He walked slowly to the witness stand, a man who looked like he had aged a decade in a few short months. He spoke in a quiet, halting voice about the woman he had married, the vibrant, energetic person she had been before the accident. He described her love for gardening, her weekly book club meetings, the way she used to sing off-key in the kitchen. Then Evelyn asked him about their life now. She can't speak, he said, his voice cracking, tears welling in his eyes. The doctors call it aphasia. The words are in her head, but she can't get them out. Sometimes she just weeps with frustration. She can't walk. I have to feed her, bathe her, help her with everything. The courtroom was silent, the jurors captivated by his simple, powerful testimony of love and loss. She's gone. The woman I married is gone, and she's been replaced by a ghost who looks like her. And it all happened, he said, his voice rising with a grief that had turned to anger. Because a police officer couldn't wait 7 minutes. The city's attorney rose for cross-examination, her approach cautious. She knew she had to tread lightly. Mr. Vance, you have a separate lawsuit filed against the city, don't you? Yes, ma'am. And that lawsuit seeks millions of dollars in damages, correct? It seeks to cover my wife's medical bills, which are already over $1 million, and to provide for her care for the rest of her life, since neither of us can work anymore, he said, his voice gaining a spark of its former strength. So you have a significant financial interest in the outcome of this trial, don't you? Ma'am, Mr. Vance said, leaning forward and looking directly at the jury. If I won the lottery tomorrow, it wouldn't give me my wife back. It wouldn't let me hear her voice again. Money isn't going to fix what happened to her. He then turned his head and looked at the defense table. But I can tell you what might have. A few more minutes. That's what the doctors told me. The paramedic was doing his job. He was trying to give her those minutes. The time that your police officer stole from her. And from me. The attorney had no more questions. She had tried to paint him as a biased witness motivated by greed, and instead he had turned it around, delivering the most powerful indictment of her client's actions imaginable. The rest of the day was filled with testimony from other witnesses. Sarah took the stand, her voice shaking with anger as she recounted how she had to watch her partner be arrested while their patient went into cardiac arrest. One of the firefighters testified, describing Riley's aggressive behavior and Marcus's calm professionalism. The ER doctor who treated Eleanor took the stand, explaining in precise clinical detail how the delay in transport had directly contributed to the severity of her stroke. With each witness, Evelyn was building a wall of evidence around Officer Riley, brick by brick. The next morning, it was Marcus's turn. He walked to the stand with a quiet confidence. For an hour, Evelyn led him through his story, his training, and the events on the highway. His testimony was clear, concise, and devoid of melodrama. He spoke not as a victim, but as a professional, explaining a catastrophic failure in interagency cooperation. Then Evelyn walked to the large screen set up in front of the jury box. "Your Honor, the plaintiff would now like to play the body camera footage of Officer Nolan Riley." The lights in the courtroom were dimmed slightly. The room was silent as the video began to play. For the next 10 minutes, the jury was transported to the side of I-95. They saw the scene through the eyes of the man who caused the crisis. They saw Marcus's focused professionalism. They saw Eleanor Vance's gray, dying face. They heard Riley's aggressive demands and Marcus's calm, firm refusals. And then they saw it. They saw Riley, from his own point of view, lunge forward and grab Marcus. They saw him yank him away from his patient. They saw him spin him around and force his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic clicks of the handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. Several jurors flinched. One woman put her hand over her mouth in shock. They weren't just hearing about the arrest anymore, they were witnessing an assault. When the video ended and the lights came up, the impact was visceral. It was no longer a matter of he said, she said. It was a matter of objective, undeniable reality. The city's attorney knew she was in deep trouble. Her cross-examination of Marcus was tentative and ineffective. After Marcus stepped down, the defense had no choice but to call their only witness, Officer Nolan Riley himself. He knew what was coming. Evelyn's cross-examination was surgical. After establishing the facts, she asked him one final question. "Officer Riley, watching that video today, seeing what happened to Mrs. Vance, is there anything you would have done differently?" It was a lifeline, a chance to show some remorse. He could have said he misjudged the situation. He could have said he regretted the outcome. But he didn't. His pride, the same pride that had caused the disaster, would not let him. "No," Riley said, his voice defiant. "I stand by my actions. I was following my training." It was a stunning admission of unrepentant arrogance. In that single defiant answer, Dean Riley had sealed his own fate. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. The city's attorney did her best with a losing hand. She argued that Officer Riley's actions, while perhaps not ideal, were made in a high-stress environment. She pleaded with the jury not to judge him with the benefit of hindsight. "Police officers have to make split-second decisions," she argued. "It may not have been the perfect decision, but it was not a violation of the Constitution." Then Evelyn Reed rose to give her closing statement. She didn't shout. She didn't use flashy rhetoric. She spoke with a quiet, righteous anger that was far more powerful. She stood directly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each of them. "For 4 days we have talked about laws and procedures and amendments," she began. "But this case isn't about that. This case is about a choice. Officer Nolan Riley arrived at a scene where a man was on his knees fighting to keep a woman's heart beating, and he had a choice. He could have chosen to help. He could have chosen to protect the scene, to direct traffic, to give that paramedic the space he needed to do his sacred work. He could have chosen to be a partner." She walked over to the evidence table and picked up a pair of handcuffs, holding them up for the jury to see. Instead, he chose this. He chose his ego. He chose his authority. He looked at a life hanging in the balance and decided that seeing a paramedic's driver's license was more important. He chose to turn a medical rescue into a crime scene of his own making. She let the silence hang in the air. Marcus Thorne also had a choice. He could have complied. It would have been the easy thing to do. But he chose his oath. He chose his patient. He chose to honor his duty, even when it meant being humiliated, arrested, and caged like an animal. He chose to be a paramedic. She turned and pointed at Riley, who sat stiffly at the defense table. His decision cost Eleanor Vance her health, her voice, and her life as she knew it. Marcus Thorne's decision is the only reason she is alive to tell her story today, in whatever way she can. Evelyn turned back to the jury, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The city wants you to believe this was a split-second decision gone wrong. But the video shows you this was a 7-minute campaign of harassment and intimidation. They want you to excuse his action, but he sat on that stand yesterday and told you he wouldn't change a thing. He is asking you to ratify his behavior. He is asking you to tell every police officer in this country that it is acceptable to pull a first responder off a dying patient. She paused, letting her final words sink in. Your verdict today will do more than decide this case. It will send a message about what we value as a society. Do we value blind obedience over professional duty? Do we value ego over empathy? Do we value a badge over a human life? Send a message that the answer is no. The jury filed out of the room. The wait began. An hour passed, then 2. Just after 3 p.m., the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The jurors filed back into the box, their faces unreadable. The foreman handed a slip of paper to the clerk. In the matter of Thorne versus Riley and the city, the clerk began, her voice echoing in the silent room. On the claim of unlawful seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff, Marcus Thorne. A gasp went through the courtroom. On the claim of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff, Marcus Thorne. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut as tears began to stream down his face. We will now read the damages, the clerk continued. For compensatory damages, including emotional distress and reputational harm, we award the plaintiff $1, $8 million. The number was staggering, but she wasn't finished. And for punitive damages to be levied against Officer Nolan Riley and the city for its willful and reckless disregard for the plaintiff's constitutional rights, we award the plaintiff $16 million. The courtroom erupted. $17.8 million. It was a thunderous verdict, a number so large it was clearly meant not just to compensate, but to punish. It was a statement. The jury hadn't just sided with Marcus. They had adopted his outrage. They had sent the message Evelyn had asked for, so loud and clear it would be heard in every police precinct and city hall in America. Marcus sobbed, not for the money, but for the overwhelming sense of vindication. The jury had seen him, they had heard him, and they had believed him. Justice had been done. The verdict was an earthquake. The $17.8 million judgment sent shockwaves through the city. The first domino to fall was Officer Nolan Riley. Less than a week later, he was fired. His career in law enforcement was over. Facing immense public pressure and the even larger lawsuit from Eleanor Vance's family, which they settled out of court for a massive, undisclosed sum, the City Council approved a sweeping overhaul of police training and policy. The new policy became known informally as the Thorne Mandate, making it explicit that at a medical emergency, the senior paramedic was in command of patient care, and any interference by law enforcement was grounds for immediate dismissal. Marcus's ordeal became a case study in police academies and paramedic training programs nationwide. The body camera footage, once evidence, was now a powerful educational tool. He eventually returned to work at Station 15. Things were different. Officers at scenes treated him with a new level of respect, a deference. He had fought the war so his colleagues could do their jobs in peace. In the quiet moments after a storm, reflection offers a clarity that the chaos itself can never provide. Looking back, it becomes possible to see the intricate web of choices that led to that sun-drenched confrontation on the highway. What drove Officer Nolan Riley? It wasn't simple malice, but something more insidious, a deep-seated insecurity masked by a rigid, aggressive interpretation of authority. Perhaps his training, or his own life experience, had taught him that control was paramount, that any challenge, especially from a calm, competent black man in a position of expertise, was not a difference of professional opinion, but a direct threat to his identity. His badge was not a tool for service. It was armor for his fragile ego. If Riley had been able to pause, to listen, to see Eleanor Vance as a person instead of a prop in his own power play, the entire tragedy could have been averted. If his training had emphasized de-escalation and interagency respect as much as it emphasized officer safety and control, he might have become Marcus's greatest ally on that roadside instead of his worst obstacle. And what of Marcus? If he had been less confident, less forged by the pressures of his past in the military, would he have backed down? Perhaps. If he hadn't possessed that core of steel, he might have made the easy choice to show his ID, gambling with a stranger's life to avoid a confrontation. His victory was born not just from the injustice of the moment, but from a lifetime of preparation that had unknowingly armed him for that specific fight. His refusal was not an act of spontaneous defiance, but the logical conclusion of a career spent prioritizing life above all else. This story reminds us that true courage isn't about being confrontational. It's about holding fast to one's principles when it is most difficult, when the personal cost is highest. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful action is a firm, quiet, and unshakable no. What do you think is the most important lesson from Marcus's story? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please support our channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.